So today we are going to be decorating a vintage heart cake. Okay, but this is not just any vintage heart cake. It's going to be a Louis Vuitton themed heart cake. So I'm not going to hold you. I was super duper nervous when I got this cake inquiry from my client because the color of the cake is the classic Louis Vuitton, that burnt orange-ish reddish color. Yeah, that's the color that I probably used about three to four different colors last night just to get the perfect color. And I'm really hoping that it matches. So far, it's looking good, but you know, with buttercream, sometimes when you color it, maybe the next day that color kind of changes and flows to different color. However, it looks like it's good today, so we're going to use it. Now, of course, I'm going to be starting off my cakes. I decorate all my cakes from a frozen state. I feel like it's the best way to decorate a cake. It freezes your buttercream. You don't have that wobbling, shifting type of thing going on with your cake. So I always ice my cakes when they are frozen. So that is what we are about to do. So let's get started. So I am going to start off by putting my 6-inch heart cake on a 10-inch cake drum. You always want to use a cake drum that is larger than your cake. And I would say at least 2 to 4 inches larger than your cake. That way you have room around your cake to make decorations, to make buttercream borders, or to put like a happy birthday banner or anything that you need to decorate your cake. You want to make sure you have space around it. So I typically will go, if I'm doing a 6-inch cake, I'll use a 10-inch cake board. So I usually will go 4 inches larger than what the cake is in order to be able to get all of the decorations onto the cake. And when you put your cake in a box, you want to make sure that the edges of your cake is not bumping up against the cake, because then it's going to cause your decorations to get all messed up. So you always want to make sure you have a larger cake board, at least 4 inches larger than your cake that you're doing. But what I'm doing right now, I'm just putting a little bit of buttercream on my cake board so that I can put my cake on here and it can adhere to this cake board. Okay, so I like to just center it just to make sure that my cake is pretty much in the middle, because we don't want it off-centered, because it will look really, really weird when you are adding your decorations in your buttercream borders. You want to make sure that your cake is in the middle of your cake drum. So in between my layers of my cake, I like to use a ice cream scoop when I'm putting my buttercream in between the layers, because I want to make sure that I'm using the same amount of buttercream in between each layer so that it looks consistent when the client is cutting it. Then I like to spread my buttercream evenly in between each layer, making sure I am going all the way to each edge of the cake so that my buttercream is consistent and the same height around the entire cake. This is important because you want to make sure that it's level, because if it's not level, then your cake, once you're done with it, it won't be level. Then I like to just line my layers up and make sure that everything is lined up before I start putting pressure down onto my cake. Then I like to use my offset spatula to kind of seal in my edges where my buttercream and my cake meet, and I'm just sealing that so my cake will not shift around. And again, my cake is frozen, so my buttercream is seizing up, and you will not see my cake sliding or gliding or towering over. It's nice and firm due to the fact that I am decorating a frozen cake. I can start to notice that my cake is starting to soften up only because it's been outside of the freezer for about 5 minutes. However, you can see that just in 5 minutes alone, your cake can start to get soft. So it does not take long for your cake to get from a frozen state to room temperature. So time is of the essence. You do have to kind of work in a fast pace. Now I'm just taking a little bit more buttercream so I can fill in the in-between parts where the cake and the buttercream meet, and I am just sealing in those gaps and closing everything up. And I'm doing this because I do not want any huge air bubbles in my cake. So I just want to make sure each part is filled in. So now I'm just going to start off with my crumb coat. And a crumb coat is just a very thin layer of buttercream it is the first layer of buttercream to cover your cake. It is done because you want to seal in all the crumbs that your buttercream and your offset spatula will kind of kick up. And you also want to create a shell. So this is basically the first barrier that I'm creating on my cake, so my cake can be nice and firm, and then I can also add in other layers of buttercream as well. So now that I am done with my crumb coat, I am going to stick this cake in the freezer for about 5 to 10 minutes so it can firm up again, and then I'm going to add the next layer of buttercream. So now that my crumb coat has got nice and firm on my cake, it's time to add this second coat of buttercream. So I went on ahead and added my buttercream to a piping bag so it will be a lot easier to apply the buttercream to the cake. Now I'm just going to use my offset spatula to smooth this buttercream onto my cake. So the key is to spread the buttercream onto the cake and try not to scrape so much buttercream off. You want this buttercream to stick because this is our second coat of buttercream. Although I am using colored buttercream to cover this cake, I like to use a lot of white icing on my cake before I put the color icing on, only because I don't want my clients' teeth and tongues to be stained. So I try to add as much white buttercream as possible, and it also helps you not waste so much colored buttercream. If you use a lot of white buttercream, you don't need a lot of dyed buttercream, which also helps with the flavor as well, because you don't want to add a bunch of red or black to your buttercream because it will start to affect the taste. So now I'm just using a bench scraper so I can scrape these sides and make them nice and even. We will be covering this cake with colored buttercream, but you want to make sure that your buttercream underneath is as smooth as possible. So now that we've added our second coat of buttercream, I'm going to stick this back in the freezer so this layer of buttercream can firm up. Then we will add our third layer of buttercream, which will be our colored buttercream. So now that our second coat of buttercream has firmed up very nicely in the freezer, now I'm ready to add my colored buttercream. So I already added my buttercream into a piping bag, so I'm going to go ahead and put that on a cake before it comes out. I really don't need to add too much orange buttercream on the top because I am using a edible image on the top and it will be completely covered. However, I just want to make sure that I am leveling my buttercream, and I want to make sure that it is nice and flat before I do add that edible image onto the top. So now that I've added my colored buttercream onto my cake, I want this to stiffen up once again. So I do want to put this back in the freezer for about 10 minutes just so this buttercream can settle. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to add the final layer of buttercream onto this cake. So after adding that layer of buttercream, I did add some more just to fill in the spaces. And now I am using my bench scraper to smooth down the sides because this is actually going to be the last and final coat of buttercream that I put on the cake. Now I do like to use my butane torch on my bench scraper, and I use this so I could warm up my bench scraper, and it makes it a lot easier to smooth out the buttercream on your cake. Then if I see some spots that need to be smoothed out, I'll use the same method on my offset spatula and just fill those spaces in. So then once I'm done smoothing down all of my sides, I use a paper towel and I just get up the excess buttercream from the cake drum so that it will not show. I am using a buttercream border, but I always just like to clean up my workspace so that way you just have a clean white cake board to work on. Now I'm going to add my edible image to the top of my cake. Now up underneath my edible image, I always add a thin layer of fondant so that my edible image does not pucker and bubble up underneath. So adding a thin layer of fondant helps prevent those bubbles. So now I am just adding on the buttercream decorations onto my sides. So now that I am all done piping my buttercream, now I'm ready to add some gold sprinkles to our cake. So the last thing to add to the cake are these little satin bows right along the border of the cake. So here is the finished product of the Louis Vuitton Vintage Buttercream Heart Cake, and I think it came out beautiful. I love the added touch of the satin bows. It just really makes it look even more vintage, and I just love it. So let me know what you guys think in the comments about this vintage Louis Vuitton heart cake. I had so much fun making it, and I hope you enjoy watching along. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, and please don't forget to share and subscribe. See you guys in the next video.